Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
We're good to go. Are you in Dallas today? Or are you in
I
Detroit?
am.
Okay.
Yeah, Dallas, yeah.
So that's not your Nicolas Cage pillow cover behind you.
Oh, it is. I can make it more prevalent.
It is the greatest white elephant gift of all time. I've given that out two or three times now.
Oh, it's the best, isn't it?
Yeah, because one, it's Nicolas Cage, and two, you can make him cry blood if you really want to by flipping
Yeah.
things the other way.
Yeah, it's I have that and I have a pillowcase that's all velvet with him shirtless on it that my
Oh,
wife got me that I just put it that just sits in our bed, which we used to put on more. Now my son's 9, so it's like too weird, but for a while it was there.
you do have to be careful. You and I are on a same trajectory in terms of the ages of our kids. You have a 9-year-old son. I have 10 and 8-year old daughter and son. So we're certainly still in the thick of it for another 9 years, hopefully, before they
Yes.
start doing their own thing. But it's a weird point because they're still very reliant on you, obviously, but they're also trying to carve out their own independence as well.
Yeah, that is definitely right where you're at, right where we're at this point, because you know that they're now sneaking stuff and getting into stuff and learning new stuff, and you have to be responsible for it. So yeah, it's a weird, I don't know, it's a weird line right now with him.
Yeah, and at least for mine, or my daughter especially, she's really smart for one, which works against her at times because she thinks she can get away with it. Unfortunately, she has my poker face. So soon as she starts lying to us about sneaking candy or something else, it's like, look, this is only going to get worse if you keep lying about it. If you own it, if you accept responsibility, then maybe it'll lighten the punishment just a little bit.
Yeah, my son doesn't know that I'm like a recovering drug addict, so I'm like, like your manipulation tactics, son, aren't going to work. Like I'm aware of what you're doing. I know the cookie scheme that you're trying to pull off. I get it. I get what you're doing, you know. It's fun to watch though, to watch them try.
Yeah, you're obviously very open about your past, but it's one thing to talk to random people doing radio shows or podcasts about your addiction history. It's a completely different thing to broach that subject with your kids, though. Have you thought about when the appropriate time is for you to have that conversation with them?
No, it's weird. I'm assuming once he finds it online, like he found an old, this is not happening, not old, but I mean it's a couple years old. But I'm on it and I'm talking a story about when I was committed to a mental hospital and attacked by a werewolf. A kid, a guy who thought he was a werewolf, obviously. But he was outside talking to the neighbors and he's like, my dad got attacked by a werewolf that was naked and he was like 6. And the guy's standing there like, okay. And he asked me about it. I'm like, I'm glad that's what he took away from it, other than the psych ward part of the story and the bonging a fifth. But he had already randomly discovered it, even though he had like the kid sensor on his iPad. And like, we don't really let him watch that much stuff, you know? So we really like limit it so he doesn't become just, a zombie addict to scrolling. So the fact that he even found that was so weird to us. And then so I'm thinking like I'm just gonna wait till he finds it online, same as like the birds and the bees talk, where I'm gonna wait till he hears the most heinous thing. Like I had to wait until like I came home and had to ask my dad after my friend's older brother showed me a porn and I thought it was two girls sharing an ice cream cone. And I was like, then I realized what it was, and I'm like, Dad, and then he had like it was basically at gunpoint, for lack of a better word, that he had to explain it, where I think I'm just gonna wait till that moment where there's no way I can get out of it. That way I don't just sit because what am I gonna what like how do you feel? Like I don't wanna like put on a good cardigan and just sit down and grab a pipe and be like, listen, when if you love a girl and a girl loves you, or a guy, or something in between, or if you might just like her, maybe you paid for it. Like, I don't know what I'm gonna say at that point. Like, it's so bizarre.
Yeah, there is something to maybe trying to pave that way by showing the most heinous version of sex. Like maybe I consider when my kids have screens because we're a lot like y'all. We try and limit how much they're able to watch, what they're able to watch, how much time they're on their screens. But maybe when they do have screens, I just accidentally leave Two Girls in One Cup up on their screen. They see that and they're completely confused. And then it's a much simpler process for them. Where that's the extreme. Here's the actuality of it. But my daughter, we were at a sushi restaurant like a year ago, and
Right.
the shirts at the sushi restaurant are like sushi, drugs, music, and sex or something. And she's like, "What's sex?" And my wife started to freak out. She's like, "Oh my gosh, sex is when a man and a woman, or a man and a man, or a woman and a woman." Or blah, blah. I'm like, "Hold on, hold on. You're getting way too complicated here." She's 7. She doesn't know the intricacies, especially the confusing intricacies of sex in 2024. I'm like, sex is something that can happen when two people love one another. And we're going to leave it at that for right now. And guess what? Her little 7-year-old brain bounced to the next thing 30 seconds later.
Yeah, they don't care. I had that where we went to the cemetery to see my parents, and we're driving there, and they're in this part of Detroit where my dad grew up, but the whole area around it was burnt down in the 60s during the race riots. And my son goes, it was about that age, about 7. He goes, Dad, was there a fire? And I was like, well, look, back in the 60s, there was blacks and whites in the area didn't get along. And you see, one of them threw a bottle at a police car, and there ended up being rioting, and they burnt the city down. So I got into this, and and my and he goes, "Wait, me and my friend Blake aren't supposed to be friends?" And my wife just goes, "You could have just said yes. There was a fire." He wouldn't have had any idea. I'm getting into segregation and race relations with a 7-year-old who can't even comprehend, tying his shoes yet.
My son is an old soul and has been really since he was able to communicate. And at the age of 5, we were driving past a cemetery, and he asked, because he always asks these weirdly deep questions, and he's had an infatuation with death. Where do we go when we die? And I looked at my wife and I'm like, well, different religions think different things about this. And I go into this long, like what you're talking about, going into the
Yeah.
race ride explanation. And I get done with this rambling 2-minute incoherent nonsense. And he's like, so we don't go to a cemetery? I'm like, oh, where does your body go when you die? Well, we're probably going to turn you into a tree, son.
Yeah, that's always, yeah, he's looking for the very literal definition. And yeah, you're just, yeah, you're just like waxing fantastic about these various religions and which one you could possibly do. Well, some say heaven, some say nirvana. Some say if you kill yourself, you'll get so many virgins. Wife's like, please stop.
Oh man, well that's the
Yeah.
problem for guys like you and I. Like you, I try and fashion myself as somebody who really thinks about the nuance of issues versus pinning myself on one proverbial side versus the other. But that's a lonely place to be in this world, Dave. Regardless, though, I really appreciate your show, Normal World, which has new episodes weekly, multiple new episodes most weeks through YouTube. It is a lonely place, right? To find yourself somewhere in that gray area where you don't necessarily have a team, where you try and decide things issue to issue.
It really is. And it's odd because I'm on a show already or on a network that's definitely right leaning
Yeah.
and I'm definitely not. And it's not that I'm not right, it's not that I'm not left. I've been both of those things. And when you're young, I think you are naturally very liberal. In fact, I think you should be. I think it's strange when you meet a 17-year-old. I mean, this is an old reference, but it's why like Alex P. Keaton that Michael J. Fox played was such a character. Like you don't meet 16-year-olds that are, diehard Republicans, and I don't think you should. It's just it's odd. But as you grow older, your priorities change and your ideas change. So being there, it is odd because people will say like, "Oh, you're fence sitting, you don't want to pick a side," and the reality is I just don't believe either side. I don't believe so many people are in it for you. I don't think that there's a I don't think either side has an answer. I think there's some good ideas, and I think right now we're looking at a disaster coming up. We'll see which way it goes, but it's tough. That's why I like to make fun of all of it on Normal World because there's so much fodder, and I just like to point out everything. There's always hypocrisy, there's always stuff, and I think people are honestly afraid now to share opinions because the only people you can have a conversation with in your personal life are going to have some diehard opinions and get really pissed off at you, and everybody else just is going to be pretty quiet about it if they're sort of moderate.
Yeah, you're right about that. Name calling has become so prevalent too that as soon as somebody doesn't have anything else to add to the conversation, you immediately gain a label because you disagree with what it is that they're saying. They're trying to demean and diminish your opinion by using singular words, which I guess I understand the strategy there, and it's been very effective over these last couple of years too. But that doesn't do anything to add to the civic discourse that we need to be constantly engaged in to ensure that we're trying to at least do better, if not continuing to evolve as a people.
Yeah, that's very well put. I mean, that's the reality is immediately you go, okay, you're in a cult. No, you're in a cult. Oh, this is Orwellian. This is, there's so many uh there's just so many talking points that you see regurgitated where why are you being a parrot? That's never going to be your own opinion ever. And that's what I see is just a lot of parroting comments going at each other where it's never been an original thought. And it's talking points from both sides that it's just trained to you by mass media a lot of the times. Just say this, say this, say this. And it's hard to have an original conversation because it's just talking points and it's dull and boring. And you're right, it's just turned into name calling. And the main thing I always see is just each side is in a cult and drinking Kool-Aid. And it's like, nah, you might believe what you believe for whatever reason. Like I personally find the whole Trump almost gets shot and then Biden or Trump does get shot in the ear and then Biden's like, "Oh, hey, all right. I'm gonna keep running unless I get sick. Okay, I got sick. Bye. See you later. Okay, this is Kamala." And it happened within 24 hours and then you find all the stuff about Secret Service and if you dig into it, I just think it's all very strange. And my personal backstory is my dad died from Agent Orange. He had brain cancer. So I have very little trust for anybody who's in that kind of authority. So I don't trust any of it. And I don't think people should either. I mean, I think we saw a great example in 2020 of what happens when we put our faith into the government. It turns out, you know, you're being financially crippled, everything's being shut down. You're not really sure if you're taking a vax that's good or bad for you. It's like you're just look people like the government isn't a machine that works. It's people that are flawed. So it's being you're just listening to other people and hoping that they're accurate. That's absurd. It's like we have to be more we have to be more self-serving and self-aware than just listening to this giant fake machine controlled by people that are already owned by lobbyists.
Yeah, exactly. You have to think critically about things and understand that, both sides of the corporate press are essentially selling advertising by pushing hate of that other side. And
Yes.
at the end of the day, there's very little productive that comes from something like that. Gosh, I think back to the COVID era, specifically the vaccines, because I was on sports radio back then as well. And so I had an in to talk about those sorts of things because of the impact that it was having on sports. And as the CDC and other outlets were saying, look, if you don't want to get this vaccine for yourself, get it for your parents or for your grandparents or those who can't protect themselves. And at the same time, there were countries that were several months ahead in terms of their vaccine rollouts. And you saw that the efficacy was limited and it actually starts to flip after a while. It's like, hold on a second. Are we doing something that is fully responsible here? Are we hurrying a process along too much that could have a detrimental outcome in the long term? And it turns out that there was a bit of a detrimental outcome, but a year after the initial vaccine rollout, Rachel Walensky, head of the CDC, when asked on Capitol Hill about why she was making these grand statements about you can't get it, you can't transmit it, she's like, well, I saw that on CNN. It's like, you saw that on CNN. CNN is supposed to be repeating the information that you're giving them, not the other way around.
Right. Yeah, that's frightening when the person who's actually supposed to be in charge of making those decisions and those health calls is repeating what something from the mass media says. And I had that same issue at that time because look at Florida. I was looking at Florida going, well, they're open. There's the most elderly, supposedly, most vulnerable people, and they're doing all right. Like the death rate's low. It doesn't seem to be as big of a problem there, and they're going on as business as usual, which makes sense with herd immunity, vitamin D, anything. It's just natural things that have always worked with the human race, and then also going into the Wuhan lab thing where you finally have like Jon Stewart screaming it out and people listen, but just going, it was called the Wuhan lab. Like it has to come from somewhere. And I was at the time I was at the Anthony Cumia show and we were covering a virus that was coming from there. And I didn't think for a minute it was going to make it to America. And I'm like, they're not going to shut everything down. He's like, I don't know. We'll see. This seems very strange. But even with that, I grew up, my mom was a RN.
Mhm.
She was very, very, very bipolar and very like wash your hands, like Howard Hughes level of like scrub your hands before dinner. Oh, and would talk to me a lot about the medical field. So I knew not a lot about vaccines, but a lot about just immunity and germs and that sort of thing that had been drilled into my head since I was a small child. So the way they were doing it just didn't make sense in my head. And I mean, I've shot heroin and I was like, I don't know about this vaccine, which should alarm everybody. Where it's like, could I cook it in a spoon before I put it in me? That's an odd place to be. So if I'm thinking, I don't know if I want to put that in me when I've had every other vaccination, mind you,
Yeah.
that should be a wake-up call to anybody to have some critical thinking to say like, well, what do you know about this? Like people say research what's in it. That doesn't mean anything to me. I don't know what chemicals are. I spent 5 years in high school. You tell me anything was in it and it wouldn't matter. But the idea that they were rushing something out without anything, and in other countries people were already being negatively affected by it, just didn't add up to me. So I didn't want to take it or give it to my kid. That is that simple for me.
And if you even ask those basic questions, you get that label. You get that anti-vax label, which
Right.
sounds a lot worse than it is when you consider everything that you just mentioned there. The masks were another fascinating element of all of this because your mom was a nurse. My wife is a family nurse practitioner. So, literally, like 15 years ago, when we were starting to date, I saw somebody wearing a mask in an airport, I think. And I'm like, oh, she actually thinks that mask is going to keep her from catching whatever anybody else is giving off. Well, and she's like, well, the theory is that it keeps you from giving it to somebody else, but ultimately it was created to keep doctors from getting spittle into open wounds when they were performing surgery 100 years ago. But then all of a sudden, even after Anthony Fauci initially said that the masks aren't going to do anything to help an airborne respiratory virus, all of a sudden, oh, that flips, and they come up with an arcane 6 feet number that you're supposed to keep your distance from people. But I also was able to approach this. I can't believe we're having this conversation right now. Was not the
I
plan.
know it's a yeah, yeah, I know
But
it's
I'm happy to talk about this too. It's important that we
yeah,
talk about these things. We don't
yeah.
forget the past. I think I've heard you talk about this as well. I was always still out. Like I wasn't in that large category of people that was shut into their homes for months or in some cases years on end because of the station I was working for at the time. And I did enough behind the scenes to help keep that operation going. I was out. I was at the grocery store when there was there were Clorox wipes being used on fruit to try and make sure you weren't passing a virus along to pieces of fruit and vegetables. And
Yeah.
so I saw the insanity of it all, but I also saw after George Floyd's death and the riots that ensued that summer, how many people were getting together in close proximity and the world not completely melting down in terms of everybody dying of a virus at the same time. And so at a certain point, I end up catching it in October, got over it pretty quickly, and I'm like, wait a second here. What is going on? How big of a concern is this to somebody who's otherwise fairly healthy versus people who should be very concerned about any illness, who are dealing with obesity or old age or any other comorbidity that leaves you at serious risk of death if you catch anything?
Right. No, that's perfectly yes. And there were people that did have to worry about it, but like you said, I noticed the same psychotic thing where I'm like, so this virus is political. It has a team where it will go out and it'll protest, and even with the mask thing, I always went out. I never dealt with it. I put it on because I was supposed to. It made no sense to me because it's like, oh, keep this dirty rag in your back pocket because it wasn't even the sterile ones. I mean, you're buying cloth ones and wearing
Yeah.
them 400 times, which is the dirtiest thing I could ever imagine. All of it became very odd. And then Anthony Fauci, as we just sort of started researching him, I'm like, oh, this guy created the AZT cocktail that made AIDS worse. That's good. Like, this guy has this record number of just deaths. And then you've seen him recently when he's been, called to the mat publicly and just comes out and is basically saying that, he didn't know anything. He rushed it. And he was being built up to be this god. And the whole time he's just been kind of this irresponsible guy who's been well overpaid and doesn't actually really see patients and doesn't really do the job of being a doctor, but he's the one that was in, yeah. So no, I'm just with you. I never really bought into it, and I just kept traveling, and people are like, that's got to be hard, right? I'm like, oh, empty airplanes and always upgraded to first class. Yeah, it's the worst. Like, you should stay inside. It's terrible. Plane tickets are $4. Yeah, it's the worst thing imaginable.
Yeah, summer of 2021, we went to Colorado, and you're right, the first class tickets were less than what it normally costs to fly their economy. So I don't ever
Oh,
take my kids on first class. Occasionally, if there's like a special anniversary or something for my wife, we may spring for that. But it's like, hey, gang, guess what? We're flying first class to Colorado because everybody else is scared to fly.
yeah, it was the best. I did the same thing with my son. I'm like, all right, this is the first time you're going to be on a flight and you're going to love it. And the next time you're going to be on a flight, you're going to hate it.
Don't get used to those warm nuts, son.
No, son.
So it's very rare
Yeah.
that I get to talk to somebody who has had to deal with a breathalyzer on their car. But
Yes.
in that category, Dave, that was a low point for me. Not just having to do the breathalyzer to start the car, but being to drive on the highway at 70 miles per hour and have that thing go off, and you have to pick it up. And it's not like you're just blowing into it like you're blowing out birthday candles. You've got to like blow from your diaphragm to get the proper reading. Was that a low point in life for you, having to use a breathalyzer just to keep your car functional?
Yeah, sadly, it wasn't the lowest, but it wasn't my bottom. But no, I guess it was because I quit, but it wasn't the worst. But yeah, I remember being in a snowstorm and there was a truck jackknifing and that thing went off and there's a passenger in the car, my buddy Mike, and he's like screaming while I'm blowing into this thing, trying not to get hit with the tail end of a semi truck. And he's like, why would anyone have you do this? This is as bad as drinking and driving, like, while it's happening.
Yeah.
Because it really is like it's the most distracting thing you can possibly have to deal with behind the wheel of a car, other than, I guess, being drunk. But I can promise you, being slightly buzzed, I've been way better off than having to look down and nervously blow into that thing. I had it too where right when I was about to get off of it, was about to come out of my car, I had gotten my tether off, which is a great sentence to say, which was my alcohol scram tether, where you have to it downloads your blood alcohol level at all times.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I had been arrested 13 times, so they were pretty serious that I didn't drink, but I'd finally gotten it off, and I couldn't use any sort of alcohol for a year, so I couldn't like clean a wound if I had it. Like, I'm glad it was before COVID, or else I would have gone to jail for using alcohol the whole time. It would have been impossible to survive. Anybody who had a scram tether during COVID, I promise you, is in prison for at least 10 years. So I was at this comedy condo, and the other comic was over at a hotel, and I'd used mouthwash for the first time. I was like, this is amazing. So I used way too much of it. I'm like gurgling. I'm just enjoying the cleanest mouth I've felt in like a year. And I go down and I blow into my car, and it blows like legally dead. So you know how like it has the countdown of about 10 minutes before it'll stop your car. So I call him and I'm like, I need you to come blow in this. I can't risk blowing in this again or it's gonna stop my car. And he's like, dude, I was drinking last night. I'm like, I I'm like, how much? He's like, not much, but I'm like, I gotta take this chance. So he runs from that hotel over, and I mean, it was like the last 10 seconds of a sports movie where like it was just like 10, 9, 8. He jumps in at like 3 seconds. He grabs it, blows into it, it hits all zeros, and my car starts, and we're just like high-fiving. Dude, it was a miracle. It was just an absolute miracle. I was so lucky. So lucky. It just I was just if that thing had gone off, dude, then it was honestly the last 3 days of my uh of the thing being in my car for a
Yeah.
year.
Yeah, and if you risk it, risk that positive test or whatever, then it's going to stay on for another year at least, right?
At least if they don't take it from me. Because
Yeah,
then they
or throw
yeah,
you
they
back
have
in jail because you
yeah,
violate
then
probation.
yeah, violating probation and they want to keep you in that system so bad.
Oh God, are you kidding me? It's such a time and money suck. It's ridiculous. I went on one date with that breathalyzer, and it was one of the most humiliating things in my life because I was so embarrassed. I didn't even want to like broach it with her, but it was stupid. I should have. I should have just been like, "Look, I've got a breathalyzer on my car. And I got two DWIs. The second one was kind of BS, but I was scared out of my mind and failed the field sobriety test and refused to do the blood alcohol test, even though probably should have done that. So instead, I pick her up, blow into the car. Needless to say, there wasn't a whole lot of great conversation that date, and it probably did end early if I'm thinking hard enough about it.
It's-
Not end with me getting to kiss the cheerleader at the end of the night, like hopefully what happened after you and your buddy were able to have that sports moment with yours on
Oh
that.
yeah, nothing. Well, yeah, there's nothing that makes you look like a winner more on a date than just I picked up Bobby Kelly, who I had only met once, but he's sober, and it was '09. It was my hopefully last arrest, and
Yeah.
I was taking him to the store, and he was a comic I was working with, and he gets in my car, and right when he gets in, I just blow into this thing, and he's just dying laughing. He's calling Colin Quinn. He's like, "You're not gonna believe this." He's just like, he's crying laughing because the year before, 2 years before when he met me, he told me to stop drinking. Like, and now he's just like, you're sober now, right? I'm like, yeah, I'm sober. I'm going to meetings. I'm doing everything. But he was just like, even a couple years ago, on my sobriety anniversary, I put up a picture of me blowing into the breathalyzer that he took that day next to me playing a trumpet that he photoshopped. But he was just dying laughing. But anytime somebody would get in my car who didn't know me, who was a friend of somebody, or I had to drive a relative, because all my whole past, all my relatives knew my past because I had been a teen alcoholic, drug addict, and they all knew I was in comedy and doing better with my life. But then they get in my car and I'm just blow starting it, and they're just like, "Are you serious?" My cousins and everything. It's such an awful look, but the tether is another whole different thing because I was performing in bars and so afraid that like even if a little bit of alcohol would pour on this thing and I would have to send the reading through phone jacks. So I would be in like an actual bar and I remember one time I said, "Hey, I have to download my alcohol tether report. Do you have a phone jack?" And they're like, "Well, no, it's a business. I can't just do that." And they go, "What?" This guy goes, "I can unhook the ATM, I guess, for a minute." And I go, "Okay." So I'm literally in a bar, like with my leg attached to an ATM bar phone jack so they can get the information from my alcohol scram tether while people are like drinking and shooting pool 5 feet away from me.
Good God. Oh man. All right, last two questions real quick now, Dave, because I love you talked about having a distrust in the government earlier, but you've said in the past you have a distrust in the government, but a love for your country. And those two things, not only can they coexist, they should coexist. If you distrust your government but love your country, you need to ask important questions. What do you love about this country?
I love the freedom. I love freedom of speech. I love the fact that I can be a comedian. I love the fact that there is a lot of opportunity. And I love what America can be. Like I love the America that I grew up in the 80s and 90s. I love that my dad loved his country even though he was dragged into Vietnam, into a war that ended up killing him, but he believed in America. And I loved the fact that he taught me about JFK. Like I remember seeing JFK in the theater when I was young. And I know RFK now, and it's like, oh, I'm being name dropping, but I did a comedy tour with like him and a few other people, and I really like admire the fact that that guy's got the balls to say the things that he says. Um, but what I just love about it is that I love what this country could be if we all really actually tried. Like, I really do believe that this is a new country that has way more potential than we're actually giving it. And I hope that it ends up fleshing out into something better than we've ever seen it before. But the thing that I would say I love most about it, yeah, is simply its potential.
Yeah, if this country takes a shower, runs a brush through its hair, and stays sober long enough to get the breathalyzer off of its car, the possibilities are endless.
Yes, it'll look great on its third date without having to explain what's happened.
All right, last thing now. I love stand up. You love stand up. What do you love about stand up?
I just love the that there's so many different styles of it. But
Yeah.
the thing that I love the most at this point is the sort of personal storytelling element of it, where we can talk about stuff like this. I enjoy going over like the jokes I love the best are about somebody's own pain. Like somebody sent me a clip the other day. It was a kid in Austin, and I had never seen him, but he was talking about how his brother took his own life, or his brother died of a heroin overdose, and then his mom ended up killing herself. And he said, it's a really terrible way to find out you're not the favorite. And I was like, that is brilliant. I can't remember the kid's name, but if I saw him like that is a perfect joke. Like that's what I love about stand up is that there's so much of it now that people who are really good at it have to kind of be deeply personal and share that part of them, and it's getting more and more exciting because not that I don't love good jokes. I love good dark, clean, whatever. It doesn't matter. You can be Nate Bargatze, you can be Jeselnik. I think it's all Jimmy Carr. I think it's all very fun. But I Eddie Murphy was one of my heroes, still is. But I do love the fact that you can kind of tell these personal, very kind of deep, even one-linery jokes that are so true to you, and people are finally grabbing onto it. And I think we're kind of seeing another build to it because I think it died for a while and now you're seeing it come back. And I think I shouldn't even say it died for a while. I think it was murdered and now it's kind of starting to grow again.
Yeah, and it came back as a result of people running counter to the whole culture COVID era to things, where just the ridiculousness of it all became too much to where if we couldn't start to laugh about this stuff, then we were going to wither away and die. And I got to say, you're one of my favorites when it comes to the self-depreciating humor, to finding humor in the darkness, and you do a great job of it. So thank you so much for that. Unfortunately, if you're listening or watching right now, you cannot check Dave out at the Comedy Mothership this weekend. All the shows are sold out, but he will be back in Austin, I think, in early January at Cap City Comedy Club. And you can already get tickets to that. I just checked at capcitycomedy.com a little bit earlier. So go snag those now. You will not regret it. And do make sure to check out Normal World as well on YouTube. Multiple new episodes each and every week. Dave, thank you so much for the time today, man. It's been a real pleasure. Hopefully we can do it again before you are back in Austin at Cap City.
I'd love to. Thank you for having me.
You're still watching or listening on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, or elsewhere. We'd greatly appreciate you subscribing if you have not already, and please do like today's episode. Thanks to Gentleman Jesus for the intro and outro music. Hear more of his work at gentlemanjesus.com. Thanks to you for hanging out. For more of the show and to connect on social media, visit booksonpod.com. We'll talk to you next time on Books on Pod.